The dipper touched his lips and the water burned like metal. It was too sweet, too heavy, too wrong. Jonas spat, but the taste clung to his tongue like rust and poppy. For a heartbeat, he thought he'd swallowed poison. It was the summer of 1867, and the ridge road through the Missouri Ozarks was still raw clay and limestone, scraped open by wagon wheels and mule hooves. Jonas had hauled freight for 3 weeks straight, salt pork, seed, cheap crockery, down from Springfield, and the storm that chased him across the hollow had left his team trembling and the canvas slick with mud. He had counted on that springhouse, marked on every traveler's tongue as Cold Spring, the only sure water between towns. He knew the place, a low stone hut roofed with oak shakes, built over a vein of limestone where water trickled clear enough to mirror the sun. But something about it felt changed. 2 men stood outside when he reined in, brothers by the look of them. One taller, broad through the chest, with sandy whiskers grown ragged at the chin. The other lean, eyes quick as if measuring Jonas's purse before measuring his thirst. They greeted him with smiles too neat for the mud on their boots. The taller one lifted the dipper, water dripping steady, and said, "God's gift, cold and free." Jonas took it without thinking, throat raw from the dust. The first swallow brought relief, but the second, the second struck him with a weight he couldn't place. He blinked, and the air seemed to tilt. The brothers watched too closely, waiting, their expressions smooth as plaster saints. Jonas staggered back, wiping his mouth with the back of his sleeve. His team stamped nervously, ears flicking. Something whispered in his body to mount the wagon and leave before the weight of sleep took him down into the mud. He mumbled thanks and forced a smile, dropped a coin on the bench by the door. The lean brother's eyes lingered on it, not with gratitude, but calculation. Jonas hauled the reins hard, wheels churning up wet gravel, and drove on until the ridge fell behind him. By the time he reached a clearing, his eyelids had sunk heavy. He tied the mules to a pin oak, dropped into the grass, and blacked out. When he woke, the sun was 2 fists higher. His head throbbed. His purse was light, lighter than it had been. Worse, the road ahead showed no sign of the drover who had shared his fire the night before. A square-shouldered man named Elias Turner headed toward Jefferson City with a string of bay mares. Jonas had expected to catch his dust on the road, but there was nothing. Just ruts half filled with rainwater and silence. By dusk, Jonas made town. The innkeeper's daughter spoke first, wiping her hands on her apron. "You came from the ridge?" He nodded. Her mouth pinched. "The man with the mares, was he behind you?" Jonas shook his head. "No. Why?" She glanced at her father, then back at Jonas. "He should have passed by noon. Folks say the ridge swallows men whole." The word slid into Jonas' chest like a nail. He lay in his narrow room that night, staring at the plaster ceiling, the cast of metal still clinging to his tongue. He counted his coins again, short by 3. His knuckles tightened. It wasn't just lost silver. It was something darker, older, and he could feel it in his bones. The spring had been wrong, and the men tending it looked at him not like a guest, but like prey. Morning brought no relief. The tavern talk hummed low but constant. A drover gone, a mail rider overdue, a preacher who had not reached his circuit. Each story ended the same. Last seen on the ridge, drinking from Cold Spring. The sheriff shrugged, claimed bandits roamed the woods, but Jonas had seen enough of war to know when men lied. Bandits left bodies. Bandits left shot horses. The ridge left only silence. He saddled up with an ache still crawling behind his eyes. At the post office, he asked after mail for Jonas Avery, though he expected none. The postmaster, an old man with spectacles smudged by pipe smoke, shuffled through a stack of dead letters, parcels and envelopes never claimed. Jonas noticed the names: Elias Turner, Reverend Hall, Daniel Crowder, each marked in the same hand: uncalled for, return to sender. All men said to have taken the Ridge Road. Jonas felt the world narrow around him. He traced the names on a scrap of brown paper, folded it into his coat. Each letter was another stone on the pile. He remembered the brothers' eyes, the false sweetness of the water, the dizzy weight pressing down. He thought of Elias Turner's mares, worth more than some farms, thought of Reverend Hall's Bible, gilt-edged and bright, thought of the Lean brothers' hand brushing the dipper's rim. That night Jonas sat in the corner of the tavern with a lantern low, studying his map. The ridge ran 12 miles, marked by a thin blue line where the spring cut through. 6 disappearances in as many months, all crossing there. His hand clenched around the pencil stub. He didn't need to tell the sheriff. He didn't trust him. He needed someone who knew the taste of opium in water, who knew the way sleep could be forced into a man's throat. He needed the doctor. Outside, thunder rolled again across the hills, and Jonas swore under his breath. He could still feel the echo of that wrong sweetness in his mouth. Whatever lived at Cold Spring was no accident, and if the ridge had swallowed men whole, it had teeth, and 2 brothers feeding them.
The doctor's office smelled of carbolic and damp tobacco. Ransom Pike was a narrow man with steady hands, the kind a needle trusted. He'd cut mini balls from boys' thighs 2 summers of the war and had learned to read pain the way other men read weather. He listened while Jonas told it all plain, how the brothers watched, how the water tasted, how sleep had crawled under his ribs. "You kept some?" Pike asked. Jonas set a clay jar on the table. He'd filled it at dawn, riding back just far enough to dip the jar beneath the springhouse drip without setting foot on their stones. The cork was new, whittled from a shingle. The water inside looked innocent as glass. Pike pulled the cork with his teeth, sniffed. He didn't drink. He dipped a splinter, touched it to his tongue, waited. "Bitter but not quinine," he murmured. "Not camphor. There's a syrup to it. Could be laudanum cut with something to hide the taste. Could be poppy boiled in a tin with sugar. Whatever it is sits in the mouth like a lie." He recorked the jar and wiped his fingers on a rag. "You felt heavy?" "Like a hand on the back of my head." The doctor nodded once, the way a man nods at an answer he hoped not to hear. He went to a cupboard and brought out a small book, the leather spine cracked. "People think opium is a sleep you choose, but a little in the blood and your will loosens from your bones. A little more and you forget your purse. A little more and you forget to breathe." Jonas drew the folded scrap from his coat, the names copied in the lamplight. He spread it on Pike's table. "All last seen on the ridge. The postmasters got their letters stacked like abandoned gravestones." He pointed. "Elias Turner, Reverend Hall, Daniel Crowder, and 3 more. That road is supposed to be a throat that carries trade. Lately, it eats." "You told the sheriff?" Pike asked, though his mouth had already tightened in apology. "I told his deputy. The sheriff wasn't at liberty." "He seldom is when trouble rides with a ledger," the doctor said. They found Sheriff Jude Mallow in his office beside the jail, hat tipped forward, boots up. He was a stout man going soft, with a beard he combed when he needed time to think. He listened while Jonas spoke, and when Jonas finished, Mallow sighed through his nose, slow as syrup. "Mr. Avery, I believe you met with a rough bout of stomach and let your fear paint faces on shadows. Men go missing after wars. They drift, they drink, they aim west and never quite make a second town. Bandits pick 'em, wolves finish." He lifted a hand before Jonas could fire back. "And even if you're right, which I'm not saying I am, what would you have me do? Shut a road every farmer depends on? Guards at a spring? It'd cause panic, and panic kills commerce quicker than any outlaw. Commerce can hire men to ride the long way a week. Dead men don't buy flour. Mallow's eyes flicked to the jar under Jonas's arm. What's that? Water from the spring. I want to send some to Springfield, see if any apothecary there can name the taste. But I don't need a city man to tell me a drunk sleep from a drugged one. Jonas here lost hours after 2 swallows. Mallow drummed his fingers, then stood. His chair groaned like an old horse. All right, he said, as if granting a favor to a tiresome cousin. I'll ride up with you this afternoon. We'll have a look, talk to the fellas tending the place. If it's nothing, that's the end of it. If it's something, we proceed correct, slow, and quiet. You don't tell the tavern this plague on the water when it might be a boy putting sugar in a dipper. They stepped into the daylight like men leaving a bunker. The sun had burned the mud to a cracked skin. Grasshoppers rasped in the weeds along the boardwalk. Jonas kept the jar tucked beneath his coat. He did not trust the air around Mallow, the way every word from the man seemed to check with a ledger in his head before crossing his lips. Before riding for the ridge, Jonas made one more stop. Temperance Clark's cabin sat where the road bent around a grove of persimmon, a small house patched with boards of 3 colors, each nail hammered true. Widowed since Wilson Creek, she kept a bed for teamsters too tired to make the next town. She also kept the kind of memory that could braid stray stories into rope. She opened the door with a broom still in her hand. "Avery," she said, peering past him for a wagon that wasn't there. "You've come light, never a good sign." "I came quick. You see Elias Turner and his mares?" Her mouth went flat. "He slept out by my fence last week, said he'd water at the spring and push on before the sky got mean. I've got his name on my board. I keep names," she added, turning to show the chalk marks on a plank by the door. "Initials, dates, a note now and then. Preacher from Boonville. Boys moving fence wire. Doctor passed with saddlebags." 2 of the chalk lines ended with a neat cross. Beside them she had written, "No news." "Temperance," Jonas said carefully. "You ever drink at Cold Spring?" She nodded. "When the road was young and I was foolish. Then I got headaches that bit like a weasel at the base of my skull. It didn't make sense from water. I started boiling mine and passing it to travelers from my kettle. Those brothers don't come to my door anymore." Her voice lowered. "I watched the peddler take a dipper from them late afternoon last week. He had a whistle he blew now and then, silver piece on a strip of leather, made the prettiest sound. I heard it all the way to my steps. He blew it once and laughed. He never blew it again." She leaned the broom against the jamb. "You be careful what you stir, Jonas. The Ozark ground forgets slower than people do." Pike asked what the brothers called themselves. Temperance shrugged. "I've heard Silas used soft like a prayer, and Ephraim sharp like a warning. I don't know that they were born to those names. Folks can name themselves anything if they use the same face long enough." They left her with a promise to return by dark. The sheriff rode between them, his badge catching light, his jaw working as on a gristle of thought. As the ridge climbed, the road narrowed to 2 ruts, the trees closing in like eaves. Jays scolded from the oaks, a fox crossed, black tip-tail lifted like a banner. When the springhouse roof came into view, Mallow slowed. The brothers were there. The tall one, Silas, if Temperance had heard right, was planing a length of oak with strokes so even you could set a metronome to them. The lean one, Ephraim, stood with a ledger open on a bench, his finger traveling down the page. Their eyes rose together, the way men do who share thought the way brothers share boots. "Good afternoon, Sheriff," Silas said. "Water's running cold today. No charge as always." He smiled at Jonas with a genial blankness that felt like a mirror covering a hole. Mallow unmounted with a grunt. "I've had talk of men gone missing and their last stop being here. I aim to quiet it if it's idle, or address it if it's not." Ephraim's brow wrinkled just enough to register offense. "Folks pass both ways. We make a mark for each guest, see?" He turned the ledger so the sheriff could admire a neat column of hatch marks and dates. No names, only strokes, like fence pickets. "We are Christians and offer God's water. We are not innkeepers. We write no names. Pike stepped forward with the jar. I'd like to compare your water with this I drew earlier, your dipper, if you please. Silas slid the tin dipper forward without protest. Pike poured a spoonful of the jar into the dipper, lifted it to his nose, and frowned. He emptied the dipper on the stones, and then, before anyone could react, knelt and scooped fresh water straight from the runnel where it slid from rock to trough. He sniffed again, made a face that was not theatrical. Same shadow, he said softly to Jonas. Not a ghost, a thumbprint. Mallow glanced around, as if the trees had ears. Nothing here proves harm, he said louder than he needed. You two keep to your charity, we'll keep to the law. If I hear of trouble pinned proper to this door, I'll be back with paper. They turned to go. Jonas felt the lean brother's gaze on his shoulders like sleet. At the edge of the clearing, he stopped. You ever find things travelers leave behind? He asked without turning, voice mild. Silas's answer came too smooth. Only what the earth takes. Hats and wind, a strap here and there. God keeps the rest. On the ride down, Mallow tried to sound relieved. Looks like saints, but smells like sinners. I don't get to hang a man on a smell. He rubbed his beard. I'll write to the marshal in Springfield about riders on the road, extra eyes for a month. That's what I can do now. Jonas said nothing. He put his tongue to his teeth, and the memory of that false sweetness rose again. He thought of Temperance's chalkboard, of dead letters with stamps soft from handling. He thought of a silver whistle that made one bright sound, and then none at all. At dusk he went back to Temperance's, as promised. She had stew on, and a lantern hung low. Before he could sit, she opened a drawer and set something on the table wrapped in a square of calico. Found this under my gate this morning, she said. Didn't belong to any of my men. She unfolded the cloth. A strip of leather lay within, worn smooth, with a bright silver whistle stitched to it. The mouth of the whistle bore a smear of something dark that had dried to a tacky shell. Blood? Jonas asked. Could be, Pike said, leaning close. He tapped it gently and sniffed. Could also be syrup boiled hard. Could be both. Jonas did not speak for a breath. He slipped the leather into the pocket beneath his vest, felt its cold through the cloth, and finally took the chair Temperance had been holding with her palm.
He gave his thanks, ate what she put in front of him, and said good night without promising anything to anyone. When he lay on her spare bed staring at the plank roof, he saw again the ledger's hash marks and understood them for what they were. Not counts of kindness, but tallies a butcher keeps when the block is clean and the hands are steady. The whistle lay heavy in Jonas's vest pocket all through the next morning. Every time the leather strap brushed against his chest, he felt the silence of the man who had last blown it, Elias Turner, Reverend Hall, the peddler with the silver trinkets, all tallied, all silenced. Pike pressed for caution. We don't have paper. We don't have bodies. If you go storming, it'll be your word against theirs, and they keep their smiles neat enough to fool juries. But Jonas was not built for patience. He had driven wagons in storms where bridges gave way under the wheels. He had marched through Arkansas mud behind Union guns. He knew the smell of men who hunted not for profit, but for hunger. And Silas and Ephraim stank of it. He bought powder and lead at the general store, nodding at the clerk's small talk, though his mind was already 12 miles north. Pike agreed to meet him at dusk, but Jonas was restless. By mid-afternoon, he had saddled up and ridden alone. The ridge was quiet, the kind of quiet that hums in the ears. Jays scolded once, then stopped. The springhouse crouched in its clearing like a trap laid out neat. The dipper gleamed on the bench. The trough brimmed with clear water, but no brothers in sight. Jonas dismounted slow, revolver heavy at his side. He crouched, ran a finger along the inside rim of the trough. It smelled faintly of sweetness, too faint for proof. He dipped a rag, wrung it out, pocketed it. Then he saw the ledger. It lay open on the bench, weighted by a stone. Not names, just more hatch marks, rows of them. But one stood fresher, ink still wet. Next to it, in smaller script, a circle. No other mark bore that. He bent closer. The circle wasn't ink. It was a thumbprint, dark, sticky. A twig snapped. Jonas spun, revolver up. Silas stepped from the trees with a calm too even, wiping his hands on a cloth. Ephraim followed, eyes narrowed. "Traveler returns," Silas said mildly. "You find our water wanting? I find it poisoned, and I find your ledger tallies more than kindness." Ephraim's lip twitched. "That's so?" He moved closer, boots crunching on gravel. "Man makes bold claims without paper." Jonas kept his revolver steady. "Bold's the only thing that keeps a man breathing up here." For a heartbeat, the clearing held its breath. Then Silas smiled thin, set the cloth down, and spread his hands. "The sheriff was here. He saw what we keep. He walked away. That tells me you're chasing shadows, Mr. Avery. Shadows and grief." "You've got graves," Jonas said. "No," Ephraim corrected softly. "We've got earth. Earth swallows what it will. Men wander. Men fall. Who's to say where a ridge takes them?" Jonas's finger tightened on the trigger, but before the air could split, Pike's voice called from the trees. "Jonas!" The doctor rode into view, hat askew, horse lathered. "Marshall's men are on their way. Don't—" The brothers didn't flinch. Silas simply lowered his hands, that smile never slipping. Ephraim closed the ledger slow, tucking it under his arm. "Then let the marshal weigh shadows," he said. "We'll be here with our spring, waiting." Jonas and Pike left under the weight of their stares. Not chased, not threatened. Worse, dismissed. That night in Temperance's cabin, Jonas couldn't sleep. The whistle lay on the table, moonlight glinting off its curve. Pike sat with a pipe gone cold. "They're careful," he muttered. "Too careful. Whatever they do in dark, and they leave no bones for law to hold." "Then we make them stumble," Jonas said. "How?" "By walking the road as bait, loud enough that even careful men can't resist." Temperance, listening from the hearth, shook her head. "You'll not come back if you go alone." "I won't be alone. I'll have this whistle, and I'll have the ground to mark if I don't blow it twice by dawn." The wind outside carried the smell of wet oak, sharp and heavy. Jonas stared at the whistle, hearing in its silence the promise of reckoning. The whistle cut the dark like a blade. One shrill note, sharp enough to wake crows from the trees, echoed off the limestone ridge and scattered into the hollows. Jonas lowered it from his lips, listening. The night closed in again, thick with damp and the smell of cedar. His mule shifted uneasily beneath him, hooves scraping against gravel. Pike rode 10 paces behind, coat pulled tight, pistol awkward in his hand. He had never looked less like a doctor. "You don't need to blow it again," he muttered. "I will," Jonas said. "If I don't, Temperance will know the ridge took me." He touched the whistle once more, then tucked it beneath his vest. "That's all I need." The springhouse lantern flickered ahead. 2 silhouettes bent over the trough, their shadows thrown long and crooked against the stones. The brothers hadn't hidden tonight. They waited. Silas straightened, resting the dipper on the bench. "Evening, travelers. Roads are cruel this late." Jonas swung down from the mule, boots hitting hard. Pike followed slower, revolver trembling. "We'll water then ride," Jonas said flatly. "Of course," Silas replied, his voice as smooth as creek stone. "God's gift, cold and free." Ephraim filled the dipper, extended it with steady hand. Jonas took it but let the water spill, a silver stream hissing on gravel. "Not tonight. Your gift tastes too dear." For the first time, Ephraim's eyes narrowed. "Careful." But Jonas was already moving. He shoved past them into the springhouse, Pike at his heels. The place stank of damp wood and something sweeter beneath, rot laced with syrup. The floorboards creaked hollow under Jonas's weight. He knelt, pried at a seam with his knife. A board lifted, and the smell surged. Beneath the false floor lay a pit half full of mucked straw and waterlogged cloth, rope fibers dark with mildew, a child's shoe, the broken handle of a brooch. The sight stopped Pike cold. "God help us," he whispered. Behind them, Silas's voice carried low. "You shouldn't have done that." Jonas whirled, revolver raised. Silas filled the doorway, Ephraim just behind, both men calm as if guarding a church. "This road is our trade. Every man's got to earn. You haul your wagons, we draw from the spring. Same honest work." "Honest work doesn't leave shoes and rope in a hole," Jonas snapped. The brothers moved as one, stepping inside. The space shrank. Pike backed against the wall, hand tight on his pistol. Jonas aimed at Silas's chest. "Step back." Ephraim's smile bent cruel. "Shoot one, and the other will finish you before you draw a breath." The standoff cracked when the door creaked again. A stranger stepped in, a young drover, hat dripping rain, saddlebags slung loose. He froze at the sight of guns. I only came for water." Silas reached first, dipper in hand, smile soothing. "Drink, friend, ease the road." Jonas lunged. He slapped the dipper aside, sending it clattering across the stones. Water splashed, bitter with the same sweetness that had poisoned his tongue weeks before. The drover stumbled back, eyes wide. "Run!" Jonas barked. The boy fled, boots pounding into the night. In that heartbeat of distraction, Silas struck. His fist crashed against Jonas's jaw, snapping stars into his vision. Pike fired wild, the shot ripping a hole through the roof beam. Ephraim lunged, knife flashing. The springhouse roared alive with violence. Jonas grappled Silas, the two men crashing against the trough. Boards splintered under their weight, cold water spilling over. Pike swung the butt of his revolver, catching Ephraim across the temple, but not before the knife slashed a line across his sleeve. Smoke from the fired shot clung thick. In the confusion, a lantern toppled, oil spilling across straw. Heat rolled up the walls, catching dry oak. Silas shoved Jonas hard and bellowed to his brother, "Now!" Ephraim grabbed the ledger from the bench, clutching it like scripture. Together the brothers bolted through the doorway and vanished into the night woods. Jonas staggered up, chest heaving. Pike coughed through smoke. "We can't stay!" But Jonas's eyes locked on the false pit, firelight dancing across the evidence within. He knew they couldn't drag it all out, not with fire racing the beams. The fire was no accident. The brothers had set their own erasure. "Out!" he shouted, hauling Pike into the clearing. Behind them, the springhouse groaned and flared, fire climbing high. Sparks swirled into the black sky, carrying with them whatever truth the boards had hidden. By dawn, nothing remained but charred stone walls and the stench of smoke. The road stretched empty, the brothers gone into the hollows. but the ground had not yet given up all its secrets. Jonas stood with the whistle in his hand, its silver mouth darkened by soot. "They'll run," he muttered, "but they won't outrun what they left buried."
By mid-morning, the ruins steamed like a black kettle. The spring still ran, glassy and indifferent, shouldering past the charred stones of the trough and curling into a round, mortar-lined hole 3 feet from the wall. Jonas toed the edge and heard the hollow echo that told him what he needed to know. "Cistern," he said. "It keeps, even when the trough dries." He looked up at the knot of townsfolk who'd come on the talk of fire, farmers with wet sleeves, the innkeeper's boy with a coil of rope, Temperance with a jaw set. "We dam the run, we dip it to mud." They worked without order until Jonas gave it to them. Boards at the run to slow the flow, a line of buckets, a plank laid near the lips so no one slid in. Pike stood with his sleeves rolled and a rag tied over his mouth. Sheriff Mallow arrived late, hat pulled down, already calling for restraint. "This is a scene, gentlemen. You trample it, no court will hear it." Pike didn't look up. A court can't hear what the creek carries away. The first dozen buckets came up clear, save for leaves and little gray worms. Then the water went tea-dark, and the smell coming off it turned from cold limestone to something sweet-sour, like fruit going to rotten under a porch. A boy gagged. Temperance murmured a prayer so soft it was mostly breath. Jonas kept the chain moving. When a bucket thumped heavy, he tipped it onto a canvas. Out slid a scatter of small brass and bone, 2 trouser buttons green with verdigris, a pair of wire eyelets from a boot, a sliver of jaw with 2 teeth still in, one worn nearly flat. Pike crouched and held the fragment to the light. "Adult," he said. "Male likely. These are not hog teeth." Mallow wiped his mouth with the back of his hand and found a tone he meant as official. "Could be anything washed in over years." Jonas pointed into the hole. "Then we'll pull years out." They did. A brass suspender clip clotted with grit, a nickel coin shaved thin and holed, looped with thread like a charm, a strip of cloth with 3 neat stitches of blue silk, a tin vial cap that smelled, when Pike scraped it with his knife, like syrup with medicine hiding in it. The bucket's rope burned tracks into palms. The sun climbed, then cracked behind a cloud. Twice the line flagged. Twice Jonas stepped into the gap and lifted. In the thin water left at the bottom, something pale showed, and for a second, everyone forgot to breathe. They drew it up slow. Not a skull, no horror the size of a face, but a knot of bones threaded with hair like weed, a handful only, terrible because it was not a thing the river makes. Pike wrapped it in damp cloth and didn't speak for a long time. Temperance set her hand flat on the canvas so it wouldn't blow. Mallow moved in finally, voice low. "Close it. We've enough to write. We don't need to spread this like seed." "We need names," Jonas answered. "Names don't float. Names sink and stick to things." "Names are for families," the sheriff said, his eyes on the canvas as if it were a ledger he didn't want to balance. "And families don't thank a town for telling them a river ate their kin." He ordered the men to cover the hole. They did, because most men would do what a badge asks when there's smoke and bone on the ground. But Jonas slipped the tin vial cap into Pike's hand first, and Pike tucked it into his bag. "We'll know more when it's dry. We'll know if it ever held laudanum." By afternoon, the clearing was a churned mess of footprints and ash footprints. The spring still flowed, as if indifferent to proof. Mallow posted a pair of men on the road and rode back toward town with a stiff spine, saying he'd gather a jury panel and hand it to a judge if one wanted close enough. Jonas watched him go and could almost hear the story being written for the paper. Bandits unknown, road unsafe after dark, trust the law. They laid what they'd found on Temperance's kitchen table. Canvas spread, bones in metal in separate lines. She stood a long time over the strip of blue-stitched cloth. That pattern was on the cuff of a farmer's Sunday shirt. He mended it himself. Sat right there as she touched the low chair by the door and told me he had hands clumsy for thread, but steady for plow. I wrote his initials on my board. She closed her eyes, opened them again, and walked outside to breathe. Pike picked char flakes from his cuffs and unfolded a pocket notebook. He drew each thing as neat as his hand would allow, writing small notes, brass, verdigris, alveolar ridge intact, Sweet odor persists on cap. Leather strap cut clean, not torn. Jonah stood at the window and watched the road bend around the persimmons. He wasn't thinking of the table or the sheriff now. He was thinking of how men move when they mean to vanish, with wind at their backs, with caches already seeded, with a map no one else can see. He found that map in their absence. Down in the hollow north of the spring, a sycamore stood with its bark seamed by a single knife nick at wrist height. Another 200 yards on, a rock face carried soot where the wind shouldn't have left any. And a little further, past the tangle of grapevine, the mouth of a cave breathed cold. He and Pike went in with lanterns low. The floor showed hands work, sweep marks, ash carried out in pails, mud tamped into a rough shelf. Against one wall lay a ring of stones black and clean. In the ring were 3 gray circles, flat, uniform, as if small kettles had sat and simmered until their fire was done. On a ledge above, someone had left a hat band, good leather, tooled, cut with 2 notches close together. Jonas ran his thumb along the nicks and understood it the way a drover understands a brand. 2 men, 1 band, a pledge or account. Pike held up the lantern. There, he pointed, to a cobalt shard caught in a crack. Jonas pried it loose with his knife. It was the neck of a bottle, thick glass, rim-chipped, no label. When Pike warmed the shard close to the flame, the cave air filled again with that heavy sweetness that had sat on the dipper like a lie. He boiled it here, he said, cut it with sugar, ladled it into the water, dosed men until breathing felt optional. They found the ghost of a ledger, too, a sheet of paper curled to a leather sliver, saved from the fire by accident or arrogance. The ink had run, but a verse still clung near the top, each letter scarred but legible. Proverbs 9:17. Pike whispered it without meaning to. Stolen waters are sweet, and bread eaten in secret is pleasant. He folded the scrap and slid it between 2 pages of his notebook. At dusk, riders from the county seat finally showed. 2 deputies in dusty coats who looked like they'd rather be anywhere else. Mallow met them at the livery and spoke with his hands. By the time Jonas pushed through the door, the story had already hardened. Suspicious fire at a spring. Volunteers found articles consistent with theft and travel. Possible grave disturbed by citizens acting beyond their remit. The younger deputy made noises about jurisdiction. The older asked if anyone had seen the brothers leave. No one had. That was the worst of it. The men who counted other men like coins slipped from a burning house into trees that carved dozens of exits. That night, the town split along its own seams. In the church, men who sold flour and tack argued for quiet. The road must stay open. They said the ridge was bigger than fear. Farmers muttered that no wagon would risk that turn if folks said ghosts kept tally there. A widow in the back stood and said she wanted the truth told in front of God. Silence didn't save her husband when the mill wheel took him, and it wouldn't save a tired drover either. The vote never came. Everyone went home with their own version. Jonas did not go home. He went to Temperance and borrowed her chalk. On his nap, he marked the spring, the sycamore nick, the soot on the rock, the cave mouth, the place where the creek dove under the ridge and came up again 2 miles on, louder than it ought to be. That bend the old hunters called the squeeze. Water forced itself through a limestone throat and roared in the dark before it saw sky. If a man wanted to vanish, Jonas thought, he'd walk the water where scent dies and prints don't hold. Pike watched him draw. You mean to finish this? I mean to make it so the next man who lifts a dipper doesn't taste sleep. In the morning, he'd go for that throat in the ridge. He'd go with a lantern and rope and a rolled canvas and whatever steadiness was left in him. The map inched under his hand until the river and the stone made sense together, and he let the chalk rest when the line reached the squeeze and couldn't go any further on paper. Outside, the night hummed with insects. In the distance, the ridge ran black against the sky, and the spring he could not forgive kept on running, patient as time.
The river narrowed to a throat of stone, a dark mouth cut into the ridge. The locals called it the squeeze. Jonas stood at its lip with rope coiled across his chest, lantern light trembling against the limestone. Pike hovered behind, muttering that no man with sense would crawl where the water itself went blind. But Jonas had no interest in sense anymore. He had interest in truth. He tied the rope to a cedar root and dropped into the chill. The current dragged like hands, sucking at his boots, pushing him toward the tunnel's gut. He pressed forward, shoulder to stone, lantern hissing from spray. Pike's voice echoed once, then the rock swallowed it whole. The squeeze was less a passage than a wound in the ridge. The ceiling scraped his back, the floor tore at his knees, and every breath carried grit. He kept moving, one palm on the rope, the other guarding the lantern. The water deepened, then shallowed, then rose again, until it finally spat him into a low cavern. Here the air smelled not of creek, but of something ranker, smoke long extinguished, old meat, damp canvas. The lantern showed ledges carved by hand, piles of straw pressed flat, and iron hooks hammered into stone. A chain still hung from one, broken at the link. Beneath it lay bones, not scattered, but stacked, a grim ledger in the dark. Jonas lowered the lantern and counted what he dared. Skulls. At least 4, maybe more in the shadow. Each one tagged by its own ruin, a jaw cleft, a brow cracked, a crown caved by blunt force. His chest knotted, and for a moment he thought he heard voices in the drip of water. He pressed a hand to the whistle at his neck. A rustle cut through the cavern. Jonas froze. The lantern's glow caught movement at the far wall, 2 figures half hidden in shadow. Silas and Ephraim. Their eyes glowed wet, their clothes ash-stained, their knives bare. "You followed the water," Silas said, voice steady as stone. "Then you belong to it." Ephraim lifted something from a crate, a book, wrapped in oilcloth, the ledger. He cradled it like scripture. "This holds every name that ever drank from us, more weight than bones." Jonas leveled his revolver, but the brothers did not flinch. Silas stepped closer, knife low. "You burn a house, and it leaves stone. You burn a name, and it leaves nothing. That's the work, Jonas. That's what feeds the road." The cavern pressed tighter, the current tugging harder, as if the ridge itself wanted its due. Jonas knew one pull on the trigger would be suicide in that space. The echo, the charge, the collapse. He backed toward the rope, lantern shaking. Silas smiled thin. "Go on. Run back to your sheriff, your school teacher, your doctor. Tell them the ridge eats men. They'll nod, they'll drink, they'll forget, but the water will remember." Jonas gripped the rope, heart hammering. "I'll drag you out one way or another, bone by bone if I must." But Ephraim only pressed the ledger to his chest and whispered, almost tender, "The water keeps better record than you." Then, as if the ridge itself had listened, the ceiling groaned. A crack split the stone above, sending gravel and spray cascading. The brothers melted into shadow, their shapes swallowed by the roar. Jonas clung to the rope as the cavern convulsed, water surged, lantern flared, and the dark slammed shut. He hauled himself back through the throat, lungs on fire, vision white. When at last he burst into the night air, Pike dragged him up the bank, both men heaving like landed fish. Behind them, the squeeze thundered. The river boiled through the ridge, carrying stone, ash, and Jonas swore the faint glint of paper dissolving in the current. He lay in the grass, coughing water, staring at the stars. The whistle at his neck rattled with each breath. Pike pressed a hand to his shoulder. "They're gone," the doctor said, voice raw. Jonas turned his head, spitting water from his teeth. "No," he rasped. "They're in the water now, and the water runs everywhere."